When we think of constitutional champions, we usually picture, the founding fathers crafting documents in their old musty homes where everything is black and white, or Supreme Court justices, usually white older men, interpreting the Constitution. But what if I told you that one of America's greatest constitutional advocates never held office, never sat on a bench, and never wrote a single law? Okay, well, let's go back to August 28, 1963, and the Lincoln Memorial. There were about 250,000 people all lined up from the reflecting pool to the Washington Monument. And Martin Luther King Jr., well, he stepped to the microphone and he did something courageous, but also something quite brilliant. You see, he didn't attack the Constitution. He embraced it. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, King declared they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. But America, he argued, had defaulted on that promise for its black citizens. The civil rights movement wasn't asking for really anything new. They were demanding what the Constitution already guaranteed. And this wasn't some, soaring rhetoric or theater. King understood something profound, and that was the Constitution was his strongest weapon. It's interesting to think about King's entire strategy. Nearly every sit-in, march, and boycott was framed as an appeal to the constitutional principles, even when it meant actually deliberately violating the law. When Birmingham police arrested King, for example, for demonstrating, he didn't just write any letter while sitting in his jail cell. He wrote a constitutional argument. The First Amendment guaranteed freedom of assembly and speech. Segregationists were, in fact, the ones violating the Constitution, he believed. Not the protesters. And the courts, well, they were listening. They were all ears. The Montgomery bus boycott that effectively launched King to prominence, well, it led to Browder v. Gale, where federal courts ruled bus segregation violated the 14th Amendment. The sit-ins? Well, the sit-ins forced the nation to confront whether constitutional promises of equality would be enforced through law. Before King and his movement, the 14th and 15th Amendments were basically sleeping giants, technically guaranteeing equal protection and voting rights, but, rarely enforced. Well, King's movement awakened them, and the results were seismic. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave the federal government real power to enforce constitutional guarantees that had, effectively gathered dust for a century. King turned parchment promises into living law. But even more radically, King pushed America to expand its constitutional vision. In his final years, he argued that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness meant nothing without economic opportunity. King saw what too many missed, and that was the Constitution. It wasn't just a museum piece to admire. It was and is a living document that demanded some action. And every time he stood at a podium, sat, in a jail cell or marched across a bridge. He was making a constitutional argument, not with legal briefs, but with his life. And when King was assassinated in 1968, he left behind a transformed constitutional culture. Not because he changed the words of the Constitution, but because he forced this country, America, to finally read them honestly. He proved that sometimes the greatest constitutional advocates aren't those who write the laws, but those who demand that they actually mean something. So the next time you read the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection under law, remember that those words only live today, really, because Martin Luther King refused to let America ignore them any longer. And by the way, if you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks.